what I'll do is I'll just kind of go through a little bit about becoming a pilot and then talk a little bit about what my day-to-day job is. And then at the end we'll do some questions. By all means, though, if there's a question that comes to your mind as we're going through it, just throw your hand up and I'll stop, answer the question while it's fresh in your minds. I work for Air Canada. This is the aircraft I fly. I'm a captain on the Airbus. We fly a 319, a 320, and a 321. So with the Airbus fleet, there are 3 different size airplanes, but pretty much my office looks like that. And all of the aircraft, even though one, the 319, for example, has 120 passengers, where the 321, the Airbus 321, has 180 passengers, we're able to fly all 3 of those aircraft because why? Because they keep a standard office. So the job's pretty neat because every day we go to work, we have a little different view out the window of the aircraft. So it's a pretty exciting career in that regard. That's the airplane that Air Canada is pretty excited about getting. This is kind of the aircraft that Boeing down in the US has developed, and it's a full composite aircraft, which makes it lighter, and it also should then hopefully bring some new advancements into the industry. And with fuel costs the way they are right now, many of the companies that have actually signed on for the Boeing 787 Dreamliner are excited because why? We're going to be able to save a lot more gas, which keeps a very competitive industry, keeps the different companies competitive within that industry. A little bit about these airplanes nowadays, just to start off with. The aircraft I fly, you can see, they got a table right here, whereas the Boeing design, they've actually got a traditional yoke. The aircraft I fly actually has a joystick, and we fly the whole aircraft off of a joystick, like a computer joystick, on each side of the, for the captain and the first officer. Whereas Boeing has a traditional yoke. But it's all fly-by-wire. It's all computerized aircraft, so when I put in any kind of control input, it sends a signal to the controls, and then hydraulic actuators actually move the controls. So that's kind of how the airplanes operate now. You can also see that we basically have what they call electronic flight information system screens, what we call glass cockpits. So everything that we have in the airplane on both of them are all basically glass screens, and all those inputs come from different monitoring systems within the aircraft. So that's kind of what the aircraft are like today, fully programmed. Before we leave on a flight, we actually set the full routing in, we set the departure in, we set the runway in, we set the whole arrival in, and it could be 6 hours, 14 hours down the road. And all of that is put into the flight management system, and we put in the winds en route, and it calculates really accurately how long it's going to take us, our fuel burns along the way, and all the different things we have to monitor. So our job really is putting the right information in and then monitoring that information as we go. We'll talk a little bit more about the day-to-day job and how we do that here a little bit later. So to become a pilot, there's really 3 main avenues, and all 3 will achieve the same outcome at the end. You will get your license, and there's different licenses. There's a private pilot license, there's the commercial pilot license, and then you get different ratings on top of that. Once you have some experience, then you can also graduate into what they call the airline transport pilot's license. Most people that are flying at the airlines in Canada today are required to have an airline transport pilot's license. So the first way is a flying school, and that'd be just like going to St. Andrews, and you sign up for flying lessons. The cost for an airplane and an instructor, they range across Canada anywhere from about $150 an hour to $250 an hour. To achieve your commercial pilot's license, I believe you still need to have around 200 hours. So if you start to do the math, you can start to see it's quite an expensive industry to get into initially. The military is another good option. And with the military, there's basically, from what I understand, I didn't come through the military route, there's basically 2 options here. And the first option is you have a university degree and you apply into their officer program, and then you can actually start right into your lessons to get your wings. The other option is that you join the military, and then they will put you through a cadet program. And again, there they put you through a post-secondary education, you get a degree, and you come back and then basically get your wings after that. With the military, they do require a commitment after, and it ranges from 5 to 7 years of actually flying for them after they put you through school and put you through your pilot's license. A recruiting officer who you would need to speak to if you want to go through and actually look at the military option. The last one is a university college degree. There's many of them across Canada now. I think we actually have one in Winnipeg. Red River College has a diploma program. And basically, you'll come out with a diploma of some sort. In some of the university programs, you'll come out with a degree. It could be an aviation-related degree, or it might be just a business management type degree or diploma. And again, what they do as an offshoot to that is they will send you through a flying program. So that's another option. This, most tuitions, I believe, with the flying built in, they range from about $30,000 a year to $50,000 a year, and the programs range from 2 to 4 years. So that's another option. Again, as you can see, it's quite an expensive industry initially to get into. Benefits to each. The one thing that I will say is that regardless of how you do it, I do recommend you get a post-secondary education. The route I took is I went just through a private flying school, and I did post-secondary education separate to it. And one of the big reasons I recommend you get a post-secondary education, well, for example, Air Canada, they have just removed their requirement to have a university degree or a diploma completed for hiring. It's supply and demand. And when we, which we do now, require pilots, we have to lessen what we actually are requiring as a part of a requirement for the people to gain employment. And because we're in such a big hiring spree right now, the competitiveness of it is that we can't just continually say we still need degrees. So just within the last week, from what I understand, they've removed that. But prior to that, for the last 5 or 6 years, we've required you to have a degree or diploma completed. And it could have been through any one of those avenues, but we did require post-secondary education. Another reason I'm big on the post-secondary education is because it also gives you a fallback. You never know if you lose your medical or if something else happens. It gives you some other alternatives, even within the airline. If you want to go into management or training, it gives you some alternatives. So again, I can't emphasize enough, if you want to put yourself above the rest when you're competing for a job, having some type of formal post-secondary education will help a lot. After you become a licensed pilot, what you need to do now is you need to try and achieve your first job. And you're going to find out that really, and in many careers, it's an inverse pyramid. As you get more experience and more skill sets in your profession, you're going to have more job opportunities, and flying is the same. Probably one of the biggest challenges pilots have is finding their very first job. And most often, and I'm not saying in all cases, but most often your first job is going to entail, if you went through the military route, being in the military and putting in your 5 to 7 years or your commitment to the military after they provided you your schooling and your flying lessons. For those that didn't go through the military, one of the other options is becoming a flight instructor and working at a flying school. So really, once you become a licensed pilot, you get an instructor rating, you're able now to provide flying lessons to other pilots that are gaining their licenses. And it's a good way to build time. And that's the whole thing about flying an aircraft, is that experience matters. We need to build time and we need to gain more experience. As you gain more experience, you become more employable in other jobs. Then the other way is to get a job in the bush, and that could be flying floats, that could be flying a small single engine or small twin. That's the route I took. I've flown all over northern BC, I've flown all over northern Manitoba, northwestern Ontario. And that's where I gained my experience. Some of you may be familiar with Bearskin Airlines, for example, out of Winnipeg here. Well, that was a company that I worked for prior to kind of moving up my next level. So again, it doesn't matter really which way route you take. The realities are that you just need to gain that experience. Now, moving up to the next level of jobs, some of them are the same. For example, if you're in the military, that next step in your career could also entail being a military pilot and continuing in that. And there are pilots that stay as instructors for their whole career. Most pilots advance into the next level, and that will include working for corporate jobs. Different businesses, for example, will have different aircraft, and they hire pilots. It's kind of a neat job because you don't know where you're going. You get to go to some pretty nice places. You get some extended layovers in some pretty nice places. So it's a neat job flying a small business jet, for example, for a different company. Then there's the regional airlines like Air Canada Jazz, like Porter, Sky Regional, different airlines out there that are at the regional level. Often they fly larger turboprops like a Dash 8 and or small jets like the the Canada Air regional jet, and you'll do regional flying. Most of it is transborder in and out of the US or domestically across Canada, and that's where really their route structures entail. The other one is a charter airline. Has anyone been on a vacation the last couple of years? Out of Winnipeg and you went down to Mexico or something like that, you probably got on an airplane with Sunwing. Or Sky Services was a company that was operating out of Winnipeg years ago. And that's another job where, again, you're flying a bigger jet, but you're doing a lot of these charter routes. So you're back and forth to the Caribbean. It often turns, unfortunately, so you don't get to enjoy a whole lot of time there. You're going down and coming back in the same day. So those are kind of that next level. And as you can see, as you kind of get that experience, it expands the job opportunities. And then you kind of graduate into the kind of what I would say, those top jobs where really there's nowhere else to go. You've kind of graduated into the different companies like the major carriers like Air Canada or a WestJet or something like that. And when we look at the employment here, corporate, I've got some good friends and that's what they do for a living. They fly a corporate jet and that's what they're going to continue to do. They could work for Walmart's or any other of these companies' corporate jets flying that around the world. The regional carriers, I've got some very good friends, and they basically become captains at these regional carriers, and that's where their career is. It pays fairly well, it's got good schedules, and it's got a lot of opportunities to make a career out of that. The military, again, there are some military pilots, and that's what they'll do for their entire career, is they'll fly for the military. Again, the charter airlines, that's a big part of the growth sector in aviation right now because they're able to offer very competitive rates to destinations that have a high traffic to, and thus there's going to be more and more charter airlines and more opportunities in the future with those airlines, and they become a career type job now. Thank you. Yeah. And then the last one in the middle here is kind of where Air Canada lies, and that's the major carriers. We're international carriers. We have narrow-body aircraft. We have wide-body aircraft. And we fly pretty much anywhere in the world. And that's, again, where there's some opportunities. All of these opportunities exist in Canada. And when you're thinking about employing yourself in the future with the aviation industry, it is a changing industry. The job I had 10 years ago is not the job I have today. The job I have today probably will not be the job I have 10 years from now. It's a competitive industry, so there's a lot of changes going on. And is it a great job? Yes, it's a great job. Are there changes happening with our job? Every day we're seeing different changes. One of the big areas that's going to present some opportunities in the next little while will be in aviation because they are forecasting a pilot shortage. They said that when I was getting into the industry. They're still saying that today. I do actually believe that is coming. We will see it in North America, but to a smaller scale. There will be job opportunities here in the future for sure, because there will always be people wanting to fly airplanes in and out of Canada and the US. So we will have job opportunities here. Where there's a big growth, and there will be a pilot shortage, is overseas. So if a person's adventurous and or open to living in other countries, China, for example, has some incredible opportunities right now. The Middle East has some incredible opportunities because, again, supply and demand with pilot shortages, the pay in those places with some of these contracts are very, very appealing for that kind of traditional money that a pilot would like to achieve in their career. And again, it's another option for people looking at getting in the industry is if you're open-minded and you're looking at, hey, I don't mind going and living in a different country, there are some other good opportunities outside of North America. As I've mentioned, to kind of move up within the industry, you need to gain experience. And I just want to review a couple of the different types of experiences out there that a pilot needs to achieve to get those next jobs. And first of all, some of the experience, most of your private commercial license will be done on a single engine aircraft. And that is great time. You need that time. It will be part of your logbook at the completion of your license. And that's kind of the first step. Then one of the things that you try to do is get into a multi-engine airplane. So there's the single-engine airplane, there's a multi-engine airplane. And what you do is you try to advance then and get some experience in a multi-engine airplane. There's some differences in how they fly. There's differences when we're dealing with emergencies with them. So that would be another step, in getting that experience, was going into a multi-engine aircraft. Float, your first job may be flying floats, and it's a great job. It's a lot of fun, especially if you like being out in the bush and fishing and things like that, because you get into some pretty neat places when you're a float pilot. The other one is turbine time. So when we first start flying aircraft, most of the aircraft we'll start on are a piston-powered aircraft. And then you'll get into more of a jet type of engine system with a turbine. But what happens is that the first jobs often involve getting onto a turboprop, which is a turbine engine that runs a prop, and like a Dash 8 that you would see, or a King Air. That's all this turbine time. So again, that's good experience, because you have to operate those engines differently than you would with a piston type aircraft. Then the next one is the jet experience, and that's going into anything from a small corporate jet to Boeing 777, hauling 400 people around. So that jet experience is another kind of step in the ladder of getting an experience. Some other just aside things is large airplane. We have different categories of airplane, and they fall into different rules and different regulations. So as you get into bigger airplanes, you'll get into different ratings, and you'll get some experience on the large airplanes. And the last one is just glass time, which is becoming more common now, because a lot of the aircraft designs today include having a glass cockpit compared to the traditional round dials like you've maybe seen in pictures. The other side of the experience here is that pilot in command, that is basically the person that's been designated to be in command of the aircraft. And the captain, for example, on a multi-crew aircraft would be designated as pilot in command. First officers on those aircraft will be getting second in command time. And that again, is probably where your first job on a multi-crew airplane will start. You'll get into the first officer seat, gain experience flying with a captain, and eventually you will then be promoted into the captain seat. At Air Canada, we also, and at many of the companies, we also have relief pilot or cruise pilot positions. And it's an entry position at Air Canada, and it's a good position, because you basically are taken on the job as a pilot, but you only fly above 10,000 feet. And what it does, it allows us, when we have to fly 14 hours across the ocean, well, a pilot can't sit in a seat for 14 hours straight. So they augment the crews. What they do is they basically add an extra pilot to the equation, and that pilot will then cycle in and out. And they basically play musical chairs. So they all take a little bit of time in their seats, and then they actually go back and they have a seat and or a sleeping bunk, and they'll sleep during the flight when they're not on duty. So they basically rotate through, and it allows a person to operate an aircraft 14 hours, 16 hours across the oceans, and still be rested enough when they get there to be alert enough for a landing. Once you gain your initial training, your experience will then involve maintaining new aircraft types. It will involve staying current on the aircraft type. And just to give an example of what I have to go through each year at Air Canada to keep current, is I go through a simulator every 8 months. And it's a 2-day session. So the first day, they'll often do training with us, just a refresher on a lot of things. And the second day, they do an evaluation on us. And they just make sure that we're still up on our emergencies, up on our drills, that our procedures are accurate. And we do that every 8 months. And that's just to maintain that if something happens, that we're able to deal with it because we're current on the procedures and emergencies. We go through ground training each year. We look at safety issues that have happened with the airline, happen in the industry. We will do crew resource management training. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And that basically involves, how do you work with other people? Because when you're doing this job, as much as you see the 2 pilots sitting at the front of an aircraft thinking that's all you have to deal with is one other person, you'll find that in many cases, you have to deal with a lot of people through your day. And you can use that, you can work with those people effectively, or you can have some big challenges in working with them if you're not, having a trust and respect for them. So we just kind of go through how do we work with other crew members. And then the last one, and the one that's kind of really taken on a little bit of focus in the last decade, has been security training. We look at anything from hijacking to terrorism and how to deal with that. So we have to do that every year, these training courses. We're also required to maintain a medical. And the medical for a commercial pilot is every year up till the age of 40. And after 40, we actually have to go to see a physician every 6 months. And they check basically how healthy are you. And they maintain and monitor our health. So again, it's important, for us when we're not on duty to maintain a healthy lifestyle, which can be challenging when you're flying lots and you're dealing with jet lag, you're dealing with eating in restaurants, you're dealing with sleeping in hotel rooms. It can be a challenge for sure. So, it's kind of an onus on you to maintain that healthy lifestyle. So that's kind of how to get to the point of working for an airline and the different options that exist. Now what I'll do is I'll just kind of walk you through my day. And this is a normal day for what happens when a pilot shows up for a flight. So basically the first thing we do is we show up and we go into a room and it's full of computers and we pull up a flight plan. And that flight plan, it covers all the information we're going to need to operate the aircraft from Toronto, for example, or Winnipeg, down into San Francisco or San Diego, for example. So we look at, first of all, what route was filed for us. So we check to make sure what the route that was filed for us is accurate and it's an acceptable route. We look at the fuel burns off of that. We look at what they call notice to airmen, NOTAMs. And they basically tell us what is operational, what's not operational at an airport. For example, a runway may be closed because it's under construction. So we have to assess, okay, does that going to affect our operations? We have to look at weather. We have to assess the weather. Not only the weather at departure and the weather at destination, but we also have to assess the weather en route. Because why? A line of thunderstorms could cause us to have to go around those thunderstorms and would require more fuel. So we have to do all this assessment as part of the pre-flight duties on our job. Once we've done that, now we actually start walking out to the aircraft. And when we get into the airplane, we then take everything that's off that flight plan and we program it into the computers on the airplane, the flight management computers. Now we're telling the aircraft what runway we want to depart off, what routing we're going to get there, and what runway we're going to arrive on. Now, some factors could change. We can get a rerouting, we can get a change of runway, but we have to have a plan before we set out. So we put all that in there, and then we just modify that once we're en route. Then we basically get our clearance, taxi out, depart, and now we're into that departure climb phase. The pre-flight, the departure climb phase, they're pretty busy parts in our lives because there's a lot happening at that point. On the climb, we will get altitude. So if you've ever taken off out of here and you see the aircraft levels off and then it climbs up again and levels off, and what they're doing is they're basically stopping us at certain altitudes because there's an aircraft coming above us, and they'll just basically kind of get us going up to our cruising altitude. So we're in constant contact with air traffic control. So you can imagine if for some reason you got airborne and you lost communication with air traffic control, you're not going to get stopped at those altitudes because you have no one to stop you. So again, we've got procedures to deal with if we ever had a communication failure. And again, you have to be current on all of this information so you understand what to do as you're flying the aircraft if something goes wrong. Then we get into cruise. And the cruise phase for us is probably our lowest workload. We're making the odd change here and there. We have to monitor systems. We have to monitor fuel burns. We have to monitor airports and weather en route. And when I say that, when I'm going down, for example, if I was leaving here Winnipeg to Vancouver, I would be checking Regina, Saskatoon. I would be checking Calgary, Edmonton, because if I ever had an emergency, I want to know what the weather's doing at those airports so that I can divert to one of those airports. So I'm always constantly looking at what are my options here if I have to go somewhere with this airplane to get safely down. So I don't want to be checking weather after I'm also trying to deal with emergencies. So we're always kind of going ahead to make sure we know what's going on so that we can be focused on the emergency if it happens rather than trying to be focused on where do we go and the emergency. So we're always constantly looking ahead at what's going on. But in saying that, we also sit there for 6 hours or 8 hours and stare out a window. So you kind of have to get along with the person that you're flying with, because you spend lots of times in a fairly small space with that individual. So the cruise phase, again, you know, we're monitoring, we're checking things, but it is probably our lowest workload phase. Now, when we get ready for our arrival at an airport, we typically plan that arrival and do all of it, the briefings and all of the stuff that we need to do for that arrival when we're in cruise. So the later part of the cruise is when we start to set up for the arrival and descent. Because again, when we start to descend the aircraft and stuff like that, we start to get busy again. We have to plan the approach, we have to monitor the weather, there's constant changes that are going to happen with air traffic control. So we try to get that all set up here when we're not busy. Then that way, all we're doing is modifying as required when we do our arrival and descent. And when we come into an airport, this is a low, foggy kind of approach, and if you can see there, the aircraft I fly actually has the ability to land itself. It has an auto-land system. And we can land the aircraft right down to 1/8 of a statute mile in fog with basically no ceiling. The Airbus A320 actually, when we do an approach to an airport that is very foggy like that, we have to let the aircraft land by our policy and procedures at Air Canada. And when the aircraft is touching down, actually neither pilot is actually looking out the window. We let the airplane do it all by itself, and we're basically monitoring the instruments as we come down for landing, and the aircraft will touch down on the center line, correct for any kind of crosswind, and actually apply the brakes and stops the aircraft. Then the fun begins for us often, because really all we're doing is monitoring, making sure nothing goes wrong. The aircraft does all the work. Where we get busy now is now we have to clear that runway, and in that same fog, try and find the terminal. And that actually, believe it or not, is a very challenging thing to do in the fog, is to try and taxi an aircraft around and stay on taxiways and get to where you want to get. So, you know, that doesn't happen often, but it can happen. And has anyone ever tried to drive your car in an 8-mile fog? It's hard to do. Well, imagine an aircraft approaching at 150 miles an hour for landing. It's, you know, it's an interesting time, and we're definitely very alert for those landings. Fortunately, that's not the norm. Fortunately, you know, most of our days are like today, where it's a pretty clear day and you got good visibility. Now, after we land and we make it to the terminal safely, basically what happens then, we check out. We, at that point, have to complete some paperwork, put the log sheets in, let maintenance know if there was any malfunctions or defects on the aircraft that need to be attended to before the next flight, and then we're done our day. We go. So that's typically what my day involves, and for me, I could do anywhere from 1 to 5 flights in a day. For the wide-body aircraft, typically they do 1 flight a day because they do longer flights. So I may go through that process 5 times a day. Now, to make all that happen, we've got to work with many different people. And really, when I say a crew, the immediate crew I have is the pilot I'm working with and the flight attendants that I'm working with. That's our immediate crew in the airplane. And once the doors are closed and we're on our way, that's the crew that we work with. But really, when you look at it, it's a great big crew that actually dispatches an airplane. And the first part of the whole flight starts with our dispatchers. So we have to communicate with them because they're the ones that develop that flight plan. So if we think we need more fuel, we have to talk to them. If we want to check on some weather conditions en route, we got to talk to them. So there's the first kind of communication part that's actually going to occur as we start to plan this. The next thing is if we get to the aircraft and there's a defect on the aircraft or we need to have something looked at, we have to deal with maintenance. So again, we're in constant communication with our maintenance personnel. Then we've got the ground handlers, and they're the ones that are loading the bags. They're the ones that are going to close the doors. They're the ones that are going to push back the aircraft. So again, we have to make sure that the bags are loaded properly, and we have to ensure those doors are closed, and we have to then, communicate with them when we're actively pushing the aircraft off the gate into the airport environment, to the live environment. We have the sales agents that we have to deal with, the gate agents. We deal with them because why? Well, first of all, they communicate with us if we have a deportee, for example. They would have to let us know. If we had a peace officer that was carrying a gun coming on the aircraft, they have to let the captain know. If there's another airline pilot that's traveling on a special pass, they'd have to let us know. So we're constantly communicating with them to kind of see what's happening with the passengers. And then lastly, the flight attendants. The flight attendants that we're going to be working the flight with, we have to actually brief with them before we actually board passengers, before we depart the aircraft. We have to brief with them, and then we basically have to maintain communication with them because since September 11th, when we had the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, they've imposed new security rules, and it's such that our flight deck door now has to be locked. So we're actually locked up to the front of the aircraft. We are able to come in and out of that environment, but there's a special procedure for us to follow. So what it's done in a lot of ways is it's isolated us from understanding what's going back on in the back. And with the temperature, what's the turbulence? Do we have a disruptive passenger? Do we have a medical emergency? So we have to constantly maintain communication with the flight attendants to see what's actually happening with the flight. So as you can see with the job, you're constantly communicating. You have to have trust with these different people because those different people, you're going to inherit anything they do wrong. If I have a baggage handler that doesn't close the door properly, and thus I have a door that comes open in flight, I inherit that problem. So I have to deal with that problem in flight. So again, you're constantly trying to stay to a standard procedure. That way you know that everybody's doing their jobs properly. So we're really big on doing it the same way every time. Now, some of the challenges that we have in our job are obviously, first one is weather. Whether it's a snowstorm where we have to de-ice or dealing with icing en route or dealing with thunderstorms, dealing with strong winds, weather is a very big challenge that we have to deal with every day. Some of the other challenges we have, this is, the lines in red there, that's Air Canada's route structure. So you can see we fly to a lot of different places. So what are some of the challenges with that? You have language barriers. When I'm dealing with air traffic control and I'm going into some of these countries where English is not their primary language, though they have to speak English because that's the universal accepted language in aviation, it doesn't mean that necessarily that their English is very strong. So we have to communicate with them, and it's hard to understand what kind of clearances they're giving us. So we want to make sure that we fully understand what they want us to do so that we do what they want us to do and we don't cause a conflict somewhere. So that's one of the challenges we have when you're flying, a network that goes to all those different countries. The other thing is that we have to understand the regulations that govern aviation, not only in our country, but in every country we fly to. So if they have different rules and different regulations, we have to comply with those different rules and regulations. So you also have to have a good understanding of the country you're operating in and out of on what their rules are. Fatigue is a big one. We work long days. You're going through multiple time zones. That's another challenge we have in our job is because you hear about jet lag. And it's hard when you come in and out of different time zones. You're sleeping in hotel rooms. So again, we have countermeasures to help us deal with fatigue because it is one of our challenges for sure. Then you've got any kind of emergency, like an engine failure, engine fire, depressurization of the cabin. You may remember back, or you may not because it was years ago, but we had a company in Canada that had a fuel leak. One of the filters wasn't on properly, and they basically lost all their fuel over the ocean. So we're constantly having to deal with what happens if we get a malfunction like that where you have a fuel leak. How do you maintain the integrity of the flight to safely arrive somewhere? Medical emergencies actually is a big one. We get a lot of those. You think about being on an airplane for 14 hours is hard enough on us. Well, we have all different kinds of people of different health and different ages flying with us. Well, we see a lot of medical emergencies. So again, when you're on the aircraft and you get a medical emergency, you have to look at how do we get this person as quickly as we can and as safely as we can into some kind of medical treatment, which often involves diverting, landing, setting up an ambulance to meet the aircraft. So it gets very busy for us. And then again, weather, like we spoke about. So